Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. And Daniel, it's good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. I'd like to talk about events going on in Syria and Turkey, top news these days. But what I'd like to do is keep sorting this out since we've been working at this for a while. Who's on whose side? It reminds me of the old song, Who's on First? You know, it looks about as jumbled up as Abbott and Costello. But we want to find out, especially with this bombing, who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. I would say that most Americans right now hate ISIS and believe it's radical Islam and we have to take on Islam and they're the guilty party, and it would be inconceivable that they would be getting any assistance from the West. But if you look at the amount of assistance they have and what they've been able to do, they have to be getting some support. But all of a sudden now we're starting to see articles, not just one. Here's one: NATO is harboring ISIS. And we have heard about the United States sending weapons over. How can they get all these weapons? And stories about how do they sell their oil? Well, it looks like they're selling it through Turkey. And so Turkey has an interest, and they're not identical to ours, except for the fact they claim our goal is to get rid of Assad. But at the same time, getting rid of Assad, how do you handle all the diverse groups? But there was a story out not too long ago in London. There was a Berlin Gildo, he was Swedish, and was being tried for aiding the Al-Qaeda in Syria. The trial was going on in London, and it was thrown out all of a sudden. Guess what? They found evidence that the people he was being tried for helping, they found out that the intelligence services of London was actually helping and funding them. So if that doesn't tip us off about what's going on, because that's a small item, but when you look at the oil and the weapons and all the bombing, everything, I think this is just telling us that we ought to look much deeper into this, and the American people ought to wake up as to who's on whose side, and actually it makes a pretty good case for non-intervention.
And even if you don't believe, even if you want to be cautious and say the U.S. is not directly arming or helping ISIS, nobody wants to believe that. But if you simply look at the fact that the U.S. sends weapons to groups that then hand them to ISIS, we've known this for years. It's extremely well documented. In a court of law, you'd certainly be culpable if you knew handing something to someone was going to break the law. So at the very least, you have this culpability.
Yeah. And they've been able to build up a lot of hatred and hostility toward ISIS, and that's probably not all that difficult because there are some tough people there. First off, there are stories now that shows that ISIS, even though they play the religious role, that this is Islam, and if you really believe in Islam, you believe in ISIS. But it turns out that there's some of the members of ISIS, maybe a large number, aren't really religious. And most Muslims would say, well, they certainly don't represent me, another Muslim, because that's not what we believe.
But the other side of the coin is it certainly stirs up anti-Muslim feelings in the U.S. I mean, it's just at the record level, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's where the real challenge is to try to neutralize all that. But let's say we do know that ISIS has committed serious violent criminal acts of killing, but compared to what? How about comparing it to what our allies do? Compare it to what Saudi Arabia does. I mean, they do more beheadings. In this recent case in the news is that there was one individual, he was a writer, a poet or something, and he was tried for a violation of religious law, blasphemy or who knows what, but it wasn't a violent act. So his penalty was 800 lashes and 4 years in prison. So he appealed it. They threw out the appeal and decided they'd retry him, and now they gave him the death penalty. And that country is our close ally and fighting for justice and fighting against this monster Assad. And at the same time, what does the UN do to straighten this mess out? They appoint Saudi Arabia head of the Human Rights Commission.
And as the head of the Human Rights Commission, they introduce a resolution condemning the human rights abuses in Syria, when most of those are being committed by the same groups that they support in Syria.
Well, All I can say is this makes a great case for us not being involved over there, and it should make people think differently about our policy, even if they want intervention. When did this trouble all start? When did it explode? When did the Civil War, the token Civil War, if you even want to call that, in 2011? Then all of a sudden, look at what's happened in the last 4+ years. And that is when we made our announcement, Assad has to go, and the French jumped on it, and everybody, is in that position. At the same time, nobody knows who's on whose side. Yeah. So, and this is a real mess. So, but this is also given this shooting down of an airplane, since it's pretty hard to say that Russia is at fault. I think the fact that they're involved is an incentive, but it also gives Russia a little bit of cover on what they're trying to do, and that is identify with a country that they've worked with for a long time, and they have contracts with, and they have agreements for a naval base, which happens all around the world. We've had relationship with a lot more, every bit as violent countries as Assad, when we think of Saddam Hussein and the rest. But now it looks like the Russians probably have the upper hand as it goes along.
Yeah, there were two very important events that preceded the shoot down of the Russian jet, and it's hard to believe they're not related to the decision, because the Turkish government story really is falling apart. But here are the two events that I think are important. First of all, the oil trade, which you've discussed. Certainly the U.S., the NSA has known about this for a long time. We've seen the trucks were there, but just a couple of weeks ago, the Russians started hitting these trucks. They've taken out the entire oil infrastructure in Syria that ISIS is running, and there are more than rumors that Turkey is heavily involved in this, including perhaps even the president's son, some say, is involved. So that's one. And the second, the Russians have been bombing this area of northeastern Syria, where you have a lot of these Al-Qaeda allies, Free Syrian Army, who are fighting, and this is supposed to be the enclave from which a opposition sort of group will be carved out. And the Russian foreign minister said this morning in a press conference, why is Turkey protecting these weapons stores? And they said, well, they're the moderates, but we've seen what these moderates do. They shoot down guys in parachutes, trying to parachute to safety, and then they celebrate over their dead bodies.
And so many in our country don't want to admit this, so they turn it into a narrow political argument. Oh, it's Obama. He's just a weakling. He won't do it. In a way, that if we were really fighting this war, the military is not very smart or very powerful, because they have accomplished essentially nothing. But people have to realize they're not accomplishing anything, because the goal isn't to accomplish anything other than one thing that it seems like motivates so many of them that persist on this, and that is to get rid of Assad. But the negotiations they've just held recently, the talk now has shifted a little bit, which indicates, I think, Russia is gaining on this, because they say, well, maybe they sort of dropped this tone, Assad has to go. We have to have some negotiations and work towards some type of negotiated peace.
But then every time the American diplomats open their mouth, they say the same thing, just in a different way.
Yeah.
But we ask ourselves, we talked about the U.S. helping ISIS and the West helping ISIS, and people will say, well, why on earth would they do that? I mean, we don't share any common values, really, or I hope that average people don't. But it's not because the U.S. government loves ISIS. It's because ISIS is a tool for what they cannot divorce themselves from, the idea that they can remake the world, that they're the masters of the universe, and that interventionism can turn the whole world around to America's interests.
And they can manipulate groups like this and use them for cannon fodder to go out and fight their wars, and once they get a job done and they get rid of Assad, we'll march in and restore sense to the country and have an election, just like we did in Iraq.
Libya.
Well, yeah, and it just ends up chaos. But it's to me pretty amazing that that there's so much support. But then when you listen to it, I know it's painful to listen to, the major networks. It's just repetitious. All stations, whether it's CNN or MSNBC or Fox, it's all, building up of hatred and showing that we're perfect angels, that we would never contrive. But our record isn't very good, because look at how we used it, and they admit it now clearly that we helped. We were on the side of Osama bin Laden to get rid of the Russians. The Russians were worse people. But then what happened? Well, we also at that time had the madrasa schools, and we literally used the CIA to build up religious animosity toward communism. Well, communism doesn't exist, and there's a vacuum over there right now, so it's being used, and it seems like, once again, it's backfiring on us, and it's very costly. It does not help our national security, and we don't see an end to it in a short period of time, although it will end, because it's a failed policy. It's just like, was it permanent that the Soviet system would last forever? Well, Mises knew it wouldn't last forever for economic reasons, and finally came to a close, almost with a whimper. It didn't work anymore, and I think that there will be a day that's probably going to happen with all our interventions around the world.
Yeah, and just a closing thought on this, the hypocrisy of the U.S. on this is just startling. The U.S. On a daily basis violates Syrian airspace, and with U.S. troops on the ground violates their territory. But here's Obama's reaction yesterday to the Turkish shoot-down. Turkey, like every country, has the right to defend its territory and airspace. It almost sounds like he's giving Syria a green light to shoot down American planes.
Yeah, but the demagogues don't worry about it. And that's been one of the things that bugged me the most in Washington. There was no sense of responsibility to have a concise philosophy and be consistent. It's so attractive to have interventionism, whether it's economics or foreign policy or even on personal behavior. Interventionism means that you have two types of intervention. Some who have a conservative moral standard, and the others have this libertine standard, and therefore they can impose this. So the whole problem is this assumption that government's role is to regulate our lives and regulate the economy and run the world. And it's impossible to do this, and instead they just demagoguing, and it's so convenient. And people say, well, they're not consistent, and even I might allude to it. They're all over the place, but they're consistent in their inconsistency because the philosophy allows that. They allow it to be whatever they want. It's pragmatism, and it isn't based on total state-owned socialism, Marxism, and it's not certainly based on the goal of personal individual liberty. So it's whatever those people in power want to say. So the civil war will continue in the Middle East as well as around the world for power, and certainly there is an ongoing civil strife. Even without any of the foreigners over there in the Middle East, there would probably still be a struggle for power and who speaks for Islam. And getting involved in that is unnecessary because there's still a lot of a religious element used, although I quite frankly haven't bought into this idea that the so-called very, very violent Islamists in ISIS represents Islam at all. I just don't believe that. And of course, what I believe is in promoting the cause of individual liberty and minding our own business and think of people as individuals and not in groups. And that is one of our major problems. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.